Oha, Hamadakiapi. Okay, Elijah Hopkins Demier, and welcome again to the Land-Based Learning podcast series. In my office here, we have again Mr. Tashi, Jeremy Redigo, Miss Sierra Atkinson, and we're going to talk a little bit about different things today related to our land-based learning project series. Last time we met, we talked about food sovereignty, a good discussion about that, and especially in lieu of all the craziness that's happening with federal funding and the ripple effect that it's had on our tribal communities. But I think the takeaway from last week was that it forces us to be more real, right? Are we Native American? Are we Native American? But it forces us to be real, right, in what we're doing. And I think before we started this recording, we were talking about, some of the stuff that we do working at a tribal college here in Fort Peck. Well, these institutions are heavily grant funded. And a lot of the cultural engagement programming that we do is meant to be sustainable, beyond that. So I think that's a good conversation. But I also think that maybe highlighting some of the projects that we have been doing around land-based learning would be good. And I guess our conversation can go wherever it wants to go. But first, I'll just kind of put this out into the ether. We have a couple of upcoming workshops, community engagement, cultural engagement activities. One is lacrosse, Dakota lacrosse. And that's where someone like Tashi Jeremy or Redigos had a lot of experience with that. So maybe we can talk about a little bit what that even is. A lot of people just automatically think of the collegiate American version of that, but its origin story is really with Dakota people and indigenous tribes around the Great Lakes and farther back east. We have some project programming coming up with Uyutapi, sign language. And again, Township Jeremy Redigo has been pretty involved in that the past few years that I'm aware of anyway. And then, in fact, we were wanting to visit with some Northern Cheyenne relatives. For whatever reason, Uyutapi still is active amongst their tribe. I think that's pretty cool, man. So there's a lot to be done. So a lot of people, I think we get hung up on, and deservedly so, with our languages, Dakota language, Nakoda language here in Fort Peck. But there's also, I think, a space and a place to revive some of these things that don't have that same attention, which is Uyutapi, plain sign language. And then at some point, whether it's today or another pod, we can talk about cultural arts programming that we've been doing. Some of our passions have been bow making, arrow making, anything like that. It isn't necessarily just the end product. It's all those things are connected to the land, the harvesting, why we are creating these things. And it's not just art, but it's meant to be practical and useful, whether to explain passage of rights for young men and women, and how are they relative in a modern world. It's not just checking the box for like a history class or Indian Ed for all, going into a school and just doing something just to check the box. We want to actually instill these things so that way they're done even outside of the classroom, and it's meant to be something that our families can use to develop themselves, their children, and our community. So I know I covered a lot right there, but Sierra, Tashi, Jeremy, Dokiri Dukcha, what you think?
Yeah, I think just those things that you have written down there and talking about, like for me, I think about how kind of Joe Williams, he'd always say, hey, Dagawas Ichikoyake, everything is connected. And so when we talk about our land-based teaching, I'm thinking in my mind, how are those things connected to the land, and how are they connected to each other, and how relevant or important they are in our modern lives. I think it's really important to understand. I had one of my mentors with my artwork is John Gozencenter from Oglala. And he would tell me, when he would do his designs and different stuff, he would say, it was important for me to be able to think that my unchi would look down and see this and that it would be recognizable as Lakota art. But at the same time, I don't want to be stuck in the 1800s. I want to be living in today's time and evolving with that. And so that's how I look at all the foundation as Dakota people, and that, of course, meaning just indigenous people, that we don't live back then, but because of what happened to our people in the last 200 years with genocide, we have to go back to that place to kind of get our footing and our grounding. But then let's also move into modern times with it. But what we're dealing with is these things that we've been indoctrinated into, meaning Western education, even talking specifically about lacrosse, modern sports, and our traditional sports and games have been colonized. And so, how do we undo a lot of that? How do we take these learnings, this foundation, and incorporate it into today's world? And I think that that's really the intention with a lot of the grant funding and programs that exist. But I think that a lot of our people, sometimes we get complacent with it. And because of what we're dealing with today, and not even to get into like politics, but the reality of the situation is that how are we going to take care of ourselves? How are we going to make not just our own personal self, but our families and our community, and then Indian country as a whole, healthy, holistically, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally? And so all these things that you were just talking about, they tie into each other and they're connected. Through lacrosse, you have the making of the equipment, the lacrosse sticks, the connection with the psechti chan, or the ash tree or hickory or whatever it is that you're using your hands, knowing how to craft it and to make it. And then the actual game itself is community based, meaning that everybody has a part in it, and that we learning the stories and the traditions that go along with it, the purpose of what they did it for, which is a lot of times goes against what we've been taught in modern society about these things. And so for young men, it was used as a way to teach them to control their emotions, because in our traditional way of playing these, you cannot lose your temper. Like, that was one rule that existed across the board, regardless of what tribe you were. It was very physical. It could even be dangerous at times, but you were expected to remain in control of your emotions. But then there were different purposes and different reasons for those games. So that looked differently depending on what the reasoning for it was. But bottom line is that it brings the community together. And then, the physical being in shape, running, all of that. Then the play, like there's so much more studies that could go into how play and just being outside, running, doing things, how beneficial that is for humans, for people. And that's not just children, that's adults and even elderly people that get benefits for it. It keeps them strong mentally, physically, in all those areas. And then going on, and the Wiyutapi, the sign language, we just went over this in my oral traditions class this past week, and tying it into, we were talking about different forms of communication traditionally amongst our Dakota people. So of course we have like oral spoken language. We have storytelling, because that's how a lot of our things are taught, is through stories. Sign language, of course. We have winter counts. We have petroglyphs, pictographs, ledgers, scrolls that were used for like the Wakawa Chipi. They would use different symbols and designs written on scrolls. Smoke signals, and aside from like the joke of like how Hollywood portrays that, but they really were things that our people used to communicate with each other. And rock cairns or whatever, like the landscape itself, how our people use those things to be able to communicate, to leave sign. And I think that communication is huge among our people. And of course, everything is different today because of the indoctrination of Western society. But I think our older people, that they had a gift for that. They were some of the greatest orators and people that like to me, I still believe that our oral traditions are still alive, even though it's not as strong or doesn't look like how it used to. It is still definitely alive. And so, how do we strengthen that? One of the challenges we have when we teach these things in um, the formal setting within these institutions is, how do we break away from the things we've been indoctrinated into, as far as like how we present these things? We research and study and do all this, to just living it. Because our elders, that's how they were. They were raised in families and homes where they were told stories at night in the wintertime, where they knew their family histories, where they watched the fluidity of the language and the sign language and all of these things and how they mesh together. And so, how do we get from a point of studying these things and researching these things to living it? And I think that in today's world, with what we're up against, is it's time for us to really get serious about it and start incorporating all of these things. Food sovereignty, doesn't matter what you're talking about. How do we incorporate it into our everyday life and make it a part of who we are, and not just doing it to, like you said, check the box for the grant requirement or whatever it may be. Our future is there. There's uncertainty there, whether we're talking about federal government or, economics, any of that. But the one way that we know the certainty of our future is if we ourselves are in control of that, meaning that we know who we are, we know how we're supposed to conduct ourselves, how we operate within our own communities, and how we're going to raise and educate our own children. And I think that, even though I don't agree with this administration and some of the stuff that they're doing, I do believe that we can take advantage of it and look at it from a different perspective without getting caught up in left or right or Democrat or Republic. Let's look at this from a Dakota lens, and how can we capitalize on this for our own communities to move forward in a good way?
Yeah, there's sometimes there's these terms that I've heard, whether it's in research or just visiting different people. But when you think about it, I think there's a term that's called deficit thinking versus strength-based thinking. So, meaning, basically boils down to what's the silver lining. And when we communicate with each other and we talk about each other, we're using strength-based languages and to uplift each other. So I think I try to be cognizant of that, how I talk to my children. And I know part of that's just a mentality. And when you were talking earlier about lacrosse, don't you? One of the things that was like impactful, I want to say, like pre-COVID, I went to invited my family to Siston. We participated in lacrosse open game, and before the match, we played, but then one of the matches, it was more of like an open game, and then it was you could bet. So you find someone on the other team if you choose to bet, and I think I brought like a bowl that I'd worked on. Man, I spent hours on that thing, and then you or somebody, we found something of equal value that you'd find a trading partner, and then you play. Whoever wins, set that aside at the end of the match, and then the winner can take that, do whatever they want to do with it. And I noticed other people, even if they weren't able-bodied, elders, they got a kick out of just sitting around there and watching younger, able-bodied people just participating. And I think that's like a free, cool community event that our tribal people probably always used to do. But when I seen that, kind of watching, bringing it back, and there wasn't a lot of people there, but I think those are the type of things that people like, because we even did that out here, Old Main Lawn, Fort Peck, 4 or 5 years ago. Wasn't a lot of people, but we're playing a game, and people were just pulling over alongside the road, kind of fascinated, just kind of watching some older coochies, or what are you guys doing? So they're asking questions. So I think those types of things, they're visual, they're out there, they're healthy. Even if you're not able-bodied, you can still reflect. That's the impression I get, that these elders, they reflect because their bodies don't move the way it used to. They get a kick out of watching younger people do that. Kind of, I think it brings them back, able to kind of go back in time and think about that. So there's a social and a mental health component to that, in addition to the physical activity of being active, that I think is important. It's tied to the land. But also just the mentality. So like with what I mean by that is like getting rid of this indoctrination of betting is bad. That's something that our people did. They would bet things within their means. They might not have been addicted or anything like that, but it was just a way to have some fun. Only wager which you could probably lose and be okay if there wasn't no animosity. So I think when we talk about this character development, those are kind of tied into those things. I think those are really important. Like, because with my children, I'm always trying to think of ways that I can be more. We talked about roles. With me is just being a better father, and so I think integrating these things into your parenting practices, I think it's key, critical, and your children will have that benefit moving forward of with identity. It always ties into identity too. So, um, yeah, and with that, I mean, we have several like cultural arts over the years that I've been working at the college. Usually, it's like bow making. We've done what quiver making, porcupine quilling. We've had Laverne come up, do a couple of those workshops. At some point this spring, I want to do another silversmithing. So uh, you might want to throw a shout out to your website where they can find some of your apparel, Tahanshi. But we do some pretty cool stuff. What was it?
I have a bracelet and it's beautiful.
Okay, yeah,
Hey, I'll do the shout out.
yeah. There you go. I was trying to throw that alley oop up there, but some of this stuff, I think, we're creating spaces for our local artisans to like demonstrate some of the work that they do. But the cool thing is watching the indigenous artwork, how it meshes with modern things, and then they're able to break out of this paradigm of, um, I guess, barter systems, making money, taking care of yourself, using your hands and your creativity, but at the same time maintaining the integrity of our indigenous art and keeping that moving forward into the future. I think it's really important. And some people are at varying levels of it. Some people, I wouldn't say they're hobbyists, but they do it. I would probably fall into that category. I enjoy doing that type of things. I don't invest that amount of time into it. Then on the more extreme end, you probably have people like Tashi Jeremy and others that are really dedicated years of their lives doing this, and it pays off. I would imagine, Tashi, there was a time when it was probably Lean Street there for a little while, but I think I've watched like someone like him evolve with some of his artwork, and now that it's kind of taken off, it's kind of cool to watch. So.
Yeah, just like anything, it's having a balance with it, and how do we remain true to our original ways of being and our responsibilities as Dakota people? And then at the same time, how do we provide for ourselves in this modern world? And I think that that's just something also, as we're talking about all of these things, is that how do we support each other as Native people? How do we, whether it's the food sovereignty part, the arts, um, whatever it is, we have people in our communities that have strengths. They do things. They have gifts. There's knowledge that they have, whether it's stuff that's been handed down to them or stuff that they went out and sought and figured it out. How do we strengthen our communities for our own economic purposes, for the spiritual support, all of these things? And I think that because of everything that's happened to us, those things are happening in our community, but on a smaller level. So how can we really start to strengthen ourselves and support each other with all these things that we're facing in these times?
I'll kind of take that and pivot the conversation a little bit, but it kind of goes into the themes you were throwing out there. But when I graduated from high school, I went to Bozeman and to MSU, and I wanted to be an environmental scientist. Like that's why I went there. That's what I wanted to do because I really, grew up with the values that the land is important and all these, every aspect to the ecosystem is important and kind of just like how we revere it. And then I got put into this Western institution learning about the environment. And so those first 2 years were really hard for me. I had a really hard time kind of learning about environmental ethics from, you could assume kind of who we were learning from or reading, these books and these philosophers from elsewhere. And I remember being in a seminar, and what we were tossing around was whether or not animals had intrinsic value, and kind of like trying to place them in, like, where we would place them in an environmental science point of view. And I just had a really hard time with that. And I was kind of like speaking out and kind of being I don't know, pushing the instructor. I was just like, why? Like, why are we having this conversation? Like, the basis of us even questioning this is why we're in the state, why we're in the state that we are now. And I felt like what I was learning was totally opposite of how I grew up. Um, and so I kind of ended up changing and went into environmental studies. And I had like a summer research opportunity that kind of helped me make that decision that I was kind of romanticizing research. And although research needs to be done, I was just kind of like, I don't know if I want to be doing this project so I was fitness testing trout that had been in captivity for over a year. And they were trying to do fish passages to like help keep rainbow trout in and or no, rainbow trout out and cutthroat trout in, because cutthroat trout are native. You go on this whole little spiel, but I just had a really hard time with that. I was like, this was this supposed to be actually done in the real world, and kind of like the scientific method and how it isolates everything. But where MSU is now is kind of different. They have like this large native center, and they have kind of more of a integration of native beliefs, and they have a couple like master's programs now that are helping bridge that gap. But my message that I want to send to youth is that now we're kind of like past that point where I was, now you have the ability to take what you learn on the reservation or just in tribal communities and in a sense kind of skip all that Western thought and like be able to know that what you have and what you learn is very important and it's needed. And that can be like the puzzle piece that's missing in this Western world. That the outlook that you have is super important and very, we need a spot at that table. And I just hope that Native youth can understand that whether or not you're in a room where you don't think you fit in and you have a totally different perspective on something, the instructor might have never thought of it that way. So, or just people that don't have that perspective. So it's whether you just think you're a little kid from the res, like you're super valuable and your voice is important. So I did some grant work this past summer where I was trying to kind of bring that in and kind of uplift Native youth to understand that STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math can all be thought of from an Indigenous perspective and point of view. And that there are people in our community that are doing it and it's needed and it's important.
Yeah, I think that like when I think about science, our people were true scientists. And I think that what we experience today in the Western world is that they've removed the spirituality from it. And our people, they kept the spirituality along with all of the natural law and other things that go on, because science is just observation. It's just paying attention to things and studying how things, affect each other and how things work, how they operate, and the interconnectedness of all of those things. And our people understood that. They understood it very well. And that's been disrupted. And it's still like when they talk about like these things are in our DNA, I really truly believe that it's inherent. Like there are things that, like, even from when I was young, that I thought differently. Back then, I didn't know how to articulate those things. I didn't know how to identify those things. I just knew that I looked at things differently than what Western education or just Western society in general, how they looked at things. And so then as we reconnect with who we are and these teachings from our elders and our communities, then it starts to make sense. And we're able to start putting those pieces of the puzzle back together. But yeah, I think that, like, when I talk to kids, it's like, have to be careful because we want to encourage them to get their education. We want to encourage them to be successful and to do things in life. But then what does that look like? You know, we can't compare ourselves to Western society, and that we have to take the strengths from our community and take that with you when you go into these places. And you're going to have to learn how to maneuver around those things because you're going to constantly be dealing with that outside influence and things that go against our belief system or the way that we know our perspective of how things are. But it can be done, and that's how these things change, you know. And I think that right now, today is probably going to be the time where we're going to have the biggest challenge with that. But we know that our people understood things, and that we have, you know, very intelligent people in our communities that are doing a lot of work. You know, so yeah, I agree with that. Science is 100% a Dakota way of being or a Cheyenne way of being or anything. It's just a different perspective of how we look at that science is all.
Yeah, and I know. I think of any people going into, especially higher education, but the school systems in general. There's either an expectation is an integration into, or assimilation, whatever you want to call it, integration into, I guess, the larger system. But I think the pushback to that is retaining your like family and cultural values heading into it, and then that way you're not, I guess, indoctrinated to the point where you kind of lose yourself. I think when people push back in those type of situations because they're starting to feel it, you know, they don't want to. Or the other, I think, flip coin to that side of that coin is like, we shouldn't be going into those things trying to validate ourselves through those systems. Yeah. If you want to do that in order to like increase your knowledge to complement what you're already doing, that's like how I look at it. And if I'm going to be sharing stuff with my children, that's kind of the approach that I have, because you don't want them to kind of lose themselves in the process. And that goes with anything, whether it's like language learning, anything taught academically. I think you have to be kind of grounded in something. I think the land itself is something that keeps us humbled, and it keeps us in a good path. So, but yeah, I think a lot of different cool things to college here. Where we got moving forward here, we have several workshops coming down the pike, whether it's cultural arts. As we're making the pivot towards the spring, we're thinking of the planting season and the cycles of things, whether it's grant funded or not. A lot of us were still trying to learn and be engaged, and so there's a season for everything. And so I don't know if you guys have any, I guess, parting comments. I think we have to hop off on another call here in a little bit, but what y'all think?
Yeah, I think it's just time for us to put things into action, you know, and we have to stop relying on the outside sources. One of my mentors from Northern Cheyenne used to always tell me, you can't solve a problem with the same mindset that created it, you know, and so we have to really think about that. And the situations that we're in today within our communities, we know where those problems came from. We know that the colonization and the genocide and all these things that were imposed on our people through the generations. So how can we reconnect with the answers? And the answers stem, you know, the foundation of it is in our culture. That doesn't mean we can't take things from the outside world, but as long as that foundation is there, we have the answers. They're in our backyard. They're in our communities. They're with our elders and our young people too, you know, because our young people know things. So yeah, that's what I want to encourage everybody is let's get busy and start doing it.
Let's get back out on the land.
Yeah, all right. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So, dok shta ke mtakipia.